we have in studio, which is always fun in studio, we have a friend of mine, and a longtime activist in Dallas, Texas. We have Russ Ramsland. He is joining us. Fortunately, it's great to have him in studio. He is the co-owner of Allied Security Operations Group and just a major committed patriot trying to work at making sure that the vote in America has integrity and truth to it. So, welcome to the show. Hi, Russ.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here as always. You know, it's a great day to be in the studio with you, Deb.
It is. It's a great day to be active in America. I'll remind our listeners, Russ visited me on the show on December 3rd, 2019, and at that time laid out, and you can go back and find that show, laid out a very detailed description of a particular kind of interference with our elections, which had to do with the changing electronically the vote count inside voting machines. This is not ballot harvesting. This is not, having people vote who aren't allowed to. This is changing data after votes are made and being held and stored in electronic voting machine. And his organization uncovered a major proof of the interference with that and the ability and actual occurrence of changing electronic votes. So I was going to start with that. Can you explain, I know we're not going to play the whole video again, but can you explain what you all uncovered?
Sure. Basically, what most Americans don't understand is that voting is done by private companies. The elections are conducted by private companies under contract from the county. And we went in and started looking at these private companies and their software and their security, and we realized, first off, there are no security standards. So there are no national standards that any voting company needs to meet as far as the security on their software. And as a result of that, we then began to look and we realized how easy it is to change votes. The software is so bad you can easily change the audit trail so that later you cannot even forensically go back and find out the votes that were changed. And that led us to a number of areas. One, we said, well, what happens to your vote after whatever the voting company locally does to it? What happens to it? Well, it turns out in the case of Texas and 28 other states, it all goes to a server in Frankfurt, Germany, which is owned by Barcelona, Spain multinational, and that's who actually controls and reports your vote.
I got to jump in. So here in Texas, if you vote early, and so your vote is being stored, you think, safely somewhere, the data about all the votes in Texas and 27 other states, the early voting data is actually being held in a server in Germany.
That is correct. And not only that, but in their process, and by a company called Seidel, and in their process, we can even see malware sitting there collecting all the credentials of all the county workers everywhere who are submitting information up, which means you can now go back into the county and change votes there too. So you don't just change it in Frankfurt, you can go back and even change it here. And the software is just that bad, and it is that insecure that someone with a reasonable knowledge of hacking could absolutely go in and change it. And we're seeing now the issue you were talking about with all the vote harvesting and absentee and early voting and mail-in voting. We're seeing what happens when software that is that bad gets out there. For instance, just looking at all the equipment, which was appalling, and the software, which is appalling, we ran into a study that a group called Kelmar Global did very recently. They looked at the last Oklahoma-Texas elections, and they discovered that 18,947 people voted in Oklahoma and Texas on the exact same day.
On the exact same day. Well, you can't drive from Texas to Oklahoma.
But you had to drive all over Texas because they voted all over Texas. Yes.
So you can actually see that in data you look at.
Yes. Oh, yeah. We've got the whole list of them.
And also, I'm remembering something from our interview was, Grant, I urge you, December 3rd, 2019, you should go back and look at the interview because we laid out a detailed video which explain to people how this was done. But I recall part of what you're saying was this isn't something, this changing of votes is not something you'd have to be a super high level hacker, that the ability to do this, to get in and change votes would really be, that would be available to anyone with just a general knowledge of.
With a reasonable hacker background, yes, absolutely. It could be done by any number of groups, particularly from overseas. that would want to, and not state actors, but individual private hackers or organizations. Mm-hmm.
And you know what's so clever about that? I hate to use a nice word like clever, but if I vote early,
Yeah.
I think I know how I voted, and I know. But once that vote has left the machine where I voted, I have no further ability ever to find out how my vote was counted. I mean, no one ever knows that their vote was changed.
No, and not only that, but we have bigger problems than that. Right here in Dallas, we have what are called ghost voters, we have phantom voters, and then we have purged voters. What are all those? Well, a phantom voter is when you, Deb, go in to vote, and you get signed in the poll book, and then you go cast your ballot, but your ballot gets attached to some other person.
And so someone had to manipulate that to do that.
Yeah.
I said that was the one you're calling phantom?
Those are phantom voters.
Okay.
Now we also have ghost voters. And ghost voters are people who live and vote from your house that you've never met and never seen. And a lot of them are from outside this country. And they are all through the voter rolls. In fact, the Open Secrets people were good enough. We work with them a lot, and they're top notch. And they were good enough to develop a little tool so that you can actually go and plug in your street address and see who else lives and votes from your house that you never know or heard of.
So that, for example, that particular kind of cheating, somebody has to be, I mean, someone's doing that. Someone's saying, I live in Venezuela, but I think I'll try to find a place to vote. You just find a random address.
Oh, yeah.
So how does that get cleaned out? How can you clean that out?
Well, it's hard because the first people that raised the issue, and we went in and started looking at it, we found out there were 3 ghosts that lived at their house, 1 in France and 2 in Australia. And they went into Dallas county elections and said, you need to get rid of these people. We've never heard of them. We don't know who they are. And they're still on the voter rolls, and one of them has already cast a vote.
So the county election official in Dallas knows about this.
Oh, absolutely.
Tony Pippin's pool or someone on her team.
Yeah, absolutely they do. They know about the phantom voters, which means that you can no longer reconcile who's checked in and who actually voted.
The system is supposed to be set up that when I check in, the system is aware I've checked in, and then once I vote, is aware of that.
And it should track you all the way through. But that's not what's happening. And not only that, not what's happening, but we're seeing people with no voter ID voting. Lots of students over at SMU are voting, and they're not on the rolls, and they have no VUID.
So the VUID being the voter
That is your
identity.
official voter ID number. And everyone who is a legitimate voter and it is on the voting rolls and has a voter registration card should have a VUID.
So that particular problem is on the clerk or the judge at the election location, because they shouldn't let you vote without a VUID.
They
Isn't that
shouldn't,
right?
but what's happening is people at the polling places are turning off their modems that correspond with Dallas. You see, the whole system is on the internet. This business that is not connected to the internet is so much garbage because it is completely connected and run through the internet. So that the people at the polling place turn off their modem if it's too slow or it's not responding, and they're just letting people check in. Or in some cases, it turns out Dallas County is turning off their modem at their end, and the guys at the polling place may be up, but Dallas County isn't up. They have no choice unless they want a line around the block or two, but to go ahead and let people vote. And now we're seeing purged voters.
Okay. Well, that should mean, the particular example you're just using, that should be a person who doesn't have a voter ID number should be only allowed to cast a provisional ballot. I mean, that's how you deal with them, right?
But they're voting.
Voting, real voting, not provisional.
Oh, yeah. No, they're real voting.
Okay, so we had phantom is when people live at your house you didn't know.
No, those are the ghosts.
Oh, that's the ghost lives at your house. Okay, yeah, okay.
The phantom is when I vote, but when it comes out the other end, your name is on it as having cast the ballot.
So who's manipulating that?
That's inside the system. And right now, ES&S that counts votes in Dallas can't explain what's going on.
So you've raised this with them.
It's been raised with them. Mm-hmm.
So they're aware of it and they have no answer.
They have no answer at this point except to say, oh, well, we're going to fix all this. Well, one of the ways they're fixing it is they're purging voters. Now, when we started tracking all this, what we had to do was take an entire voter record and attach an identifier number to it, because what was happening, and we saw it first in Harris County, what was happening was you get a list of who's voted today, and we can put that in a database, and then tomorrow you get a list of who voted that day, but then on days 1 and 3 you see the same person vote. Well, that's a problem, because now you're seeing a guy literally double voting. What Harris County did to cover that is that they quit posting lists by day, and they just post a cumulative list.
So they dedupe it.
Yeah. Well, now they post a cumulative list that doesn't add up to the 3 individual days that it's supposed to accumulate. And the reason is that now in the cumulative, they're striking voters. Yeah. But you don't know why they're striking them. They may be striking them to hide double votes, or they may be striking the wrong vote. For instance, if you go in and give a real vote, but someone has a mail-in ballot that they mail in your name, how does Harris County know which one to strike?
Well, that's what I know. I have been reading about people in this election cycle going in to vote in person. They say, "Oh, our records show you've already voted."
Absolutely.
And I know if you are the voter, I mean, you have to press and say, "No, I didn't," and if you press long enough, I suppose they'd let you vote for real as opposed to provisional. But then, well, whatever vote was attributed to you is still going to be counted.
What happens is if you go in and they tell you, "Oh no, you voted," and you know you haven't, then you just have to stay there and argue long enough to get them to actually call Dallas County. Now, at Dallas County, they can say, "Oh, no, you're right, that person and voted." For instance, we had a guy came in day before yesterday, and he said, "I just went in and they told me that I'd already voted." I said, "No, I haven't voted." And they said, "No, of course you haven't." They said, "No, I haven't." "Well, it shows on the poll books you have." Well, he argued, and they eventually called Dallas County. And Dallas County said, "Oh, no, he hadn't, but his wife has." And he said, "Wow, that's fabulous, because, she's been dead 5 years."
Okay. All these, first of all these anecdotal stories make, and I'm not saying anecdotal is incorrect, but they're little stories, and people say, okay, so there are a few fluky things, who knows how this happens? Someone checked the wrong box, they got a mail-in ballot, and they checked this box that should have been there. But those things are obviously very troubling to people. But I think the larger thing is that the availability within the system of someone determined to do something, determined to hack, I probably never gonna have a perfect election where every single vote was correctly cast and no one who wasn't supposed to vote did. But the capacity to interfere with the vote electronically or any other way is a far bigger problem, and seems that should be addressed by the voting authorities.
The operators of these systems can change the votes. I mean, think about it, Deb. On October 16th, Dallas County purged 46,000 voters, I think, votes. Now think about that. That means the operator down there has gotten to purge 46,000 votes.
Okay.
In Harris County, now they use HART, they don't use ES&S. In Harris County, on October 15th, as I recall, it may have been the 14th, they purged almost 240,000 votes.
Okay. Again, purge means they
wipe out those votes.
And how do they justify that? Because they are claiming?
They haven't justified it, and when you see numbers that big, it's indicative that there's probably some sort of a bot in the system that makes decisions about things and is just taking out certain votes and voters. And you don't know what the bot is, you don't know how it works, you don't know how it makes decisions, and you don't know whether it took out the wrong vote.
Okay, so in Dallas you mentioned 46,000?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that means literally 46,000 people in Dallas County have already voted. They have purged their vote.
Actually, no, a whole lot more than that have voted. I think at this point, the last number, as I recall, was about 100,000 total purged votes.
But the person who would be forced to justify it, their answer is they're purged because they were...
They can't explain it yet.
The system, I mean, who does it? It seems like an action someone has to take, right?
ES&S, the operators.
As the system operators, the
people who are actually conducting the election electronically here is ES&S. It's a private company.
Okay.
And the reason that we got this mess really goes back to 2002. There was the Help America Vote Act, and it came about as a result of the hanging chads. You remember those?
I do.
And so what happened was Congress, in its brilliance, did the Help America Vote Act, and they put out billions of dollars so that all these counties could buy all this electronic equipment. But there's no standards, there's no security on the systems. It's pathetic, and it's just gotten worse and worse and worse as it's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And now there is not a single system in use in the state of Texas that actually conforms to Texas law. For instance, Texas law is very clear. Texas Administrative Code is very clear about this is what is required in an audit trail. There is not a voting system in the state of Texas that complies with that.
Okay, so to remedy, actually, I still want to get into discussing what you were saying before we started about what you've been watching in Houston, what's going on there. But if you all, I mean, your organization has been diligent researching this, documenting it, making it available, people can understand it. Do you have a list of suggestions, a list of legislation that should be changed or practices that should be changed? And how this is so unacceptable.
Oh, it's totally unacceptable. Yes, actually, we have quite a few suggestions. The first one at the state level is make the Secretary of State follow the law. Right now, every Secretary of State issues all these waivers. They authorize the use of all this equipment that clearly doesn't meet state law. And it's completely out of control. And Texas is not alone in that, although we do have very serious problems in that regard. And so first, the state needs to follow the law. Secondly, we have suggestions about monitoring the communications between various servers that go on in the election system so that in real time you could capture votes being changed. You cannot go back after the fact and find an audit log that will help you determine that because A, the software is that bad, and B, in some cases, those logs don't even exist. Hart, down in Houston, they don't even have audit logs for all intents and purposes.
So an audit log would permit you to recognize when a vote had been changed?
It would be able to, yes, what happened, when it happened, and that sort of thing. And those just don't really exist because no one's insisted on them, even though it is in the Texas law that they have to have that.
Wow. It's an amazing thing. I think that, so many people in America, obviously we just pride ourselves on being a representative democracy, a democratic republic, that we vote and we create our government. And if all of the voting is subject to the kind of issues you're raising, you can begin to feel it just as, it's kind of out of your hands. There's no point in all of the campaigning and door knocking and organizing if at the end of the day the vote is subject to this kind of mischief, is a nice word, a fraud.
Nice, yes.
Okay, so tell me now, you have been working also, we played in the first 5 today, we played a little video, Project Veritas, got that one woman on tape. She's, let us hope, going to be arrested, but in fact, there were more than one person on those tapes that should be arrested. But you've also been noticing and been aware of some kind of vote fraud occurring in Houston. I don't even know the whole story, so tell us that story.
Well, we have worked down there a lot with Dr. Stephen Hotze, who has just been an incredible patriot down there. And they came across, they actually have a team of about 20 investigators on the ground, ex-FBI, ex-law enforcement people with 20, 30 years, all of them. And somewhat like Project Veritas, they have been able to get people to talk to them and give them depositions and videos and things like that. And it started out with about, they were bragging they were going to be able to harvest over 700,000 illegal votes in Harris County alone.
People speaking, they didn't realize it, but speaking to these investigators said they could harvest 700,000 votes.
Correct.
couldn't that flip Texas? I don't know the numbers. Could that,
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, Harris County, so goes Harris County, it gets pretty serious after that. But you see that in Harris County, you see that in Bexar County where Project Veritas is. It's going on up here too. Down there, interestingly enough, one of the people who was deeply implicated was Biden's campaign chair for Harris County, Dallas Jones. And the federal authorities pulled him in for a couple of days, and evidently when he got released, he also got released from the Biden campaign.
Well, that's good. I thought it was, but this Dr. Hotze you're referring to, he just got going with the idea that you want to uncover all of this. So he has investigators, very professional types, and people who are real investigators. They uncover all this. So people saying, yeah, we can bring in 700,000 votes. So what's he doing with that?
Well, he's gone to the Supreme Court now using a writ of mandamus procedure to get around all the other time-consuming court dawdling. You can go, evidently, and get writ of mandamus from the Supreme Court on certain election things because of the timeliness. Mm-hmm. And so he's been able to go in there several times and get some great rulings. You know, Harris County wanted to mail out 2.2 million mail-in ballot applications. And he was able to get that pretty well shut down. And now he hasn't won all of his court battles. But boy, he has just been a champion in leading that charge and has managed to disrupt and bring enough light in enough places that the roaches are scurrying and trying to get out of the spotlight now. And it's not going to stop at all because it's so massive, but it will certainly disrupt a fair amount of it. And ultimately, when this is over, hopefully some people will get to find out how they look in orange.
Yeah, you know, actually, after this election cycle, I've said, you know, if President Trump wins and the Republicans take back the House and we still have the Senate, I have a list of items I hope they dive into. It's getting lengthy, but one of them is about election fraud. And part of the problem is that, generally speaking, the laws surrounding how elections are administered is state law. You know, it's mostly by the states. I would love to have some lawyer who is a specialist on this say, how much can the federal government do? Because we have just a hopscotching of provisions around this country. And I mean, I don't think we have to have federally run elections, but
no.
but I do think that from the federal government to say for elections to count for federal office, you know, things like a voter ID, things like citizenship. I mean, just basic things that are just not peculiar to that election. They're not the administration and what dates precisely you have early voting, but those larger issues that will actually take us a long way to getting more confidence, at least, in the election system and maybe even more accurate elections. I'd love to see that in the federal level. But we are on all election fraud issues, we're dealing with state law. And so you're
right.
forever having.
Correct.
So where are we in Texas? I know
in Texas, we're not trying very hard. Unfortunately, you know, there is, I believe it's called ERIC, is a database that will tell you, for instance, of all the people on your voter rolls, what other state they're also registered to vote on. So that you wouldn't see the 18,947 people in Oklahoma voting both states on the same day. And Texas doesn't subscribe to that. And it doesn't purge its rolls on that. And it doesn't purge rolls at all. In fact, it's very, very hard, it turns out, as my friends found out, to go in and get ghost voters out of your house.
Okay, so this is a system that Texas could subscribe to that would do that automatically for them and say, hey, by the way, this list of voters also appears somewhere else.
Correct.
And so that would take an order of the legislature. I mean, that would take the legislature passing a law mandating that the Secretary of the Election Department does that.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. And the point, though, as I get back to, is simply that it's not enough to pass laws if there are no teeth in the laws, if there's no repercussions if you violate the law, and if you allow a Secretary of State's Elections Department to keep issuing waivers, whether they're official waivers or they're just emails that say, no, go ahead and let them do that. Because in a county, when you get an email from the SOS elections department that says, oh, that's okay, probably let them do that. They take that like an official waiver, but it doesn't show up inside the SOS as an official waiver. There's a lot of that going on.
It doesn't show up inside the what isn't?
Inside the Secretary of State. So that if the Secretary of State went to her elections department or his elections department and said, you know, show me all the waivers we issued, well, there really might not be very many. But the truth of the matter is there may be 60 or 70 emails that have been sent out that were treated like waivers by the local people.
Are you talking about waivers? You're saying permission given for an individual voter to vote, to say?
No. Permission for elections departments to do things that are clearly in contravention to Texas law.
Waivers for compliance with Texas state law.
Correct.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So Texas, which, I mean, most people, I'm always bragging about Texas on this show. You know, it's generally speaking, I always say Texas is what America's supposed to be. It's the state committed to the idea of the Declaration of Independence, committed to the whole idea of the freedom of the individual, the whole notion of America. And if we have that problem here, and Texas is in the ballpark of Republican run, although I could contest some individuals, you know, it's Republican run. Imagine in states where there's more of the ethos that just says, which I think is, and I will venture out and say this, I think in America, if we had an election system for every election that only legal voters could vote, and they could only vote once, and no one was on the voter rolls who isn't really permitted to vote, and no ballot harvesting occurred, and no mail-in ballot fraud occurred, we just had straight-up voting, I think more Republicans would win more elections. I think, even though I'm in favor of prosecuting election fraud, vote fraud, no matter which side of the aisle it's on, no matter who's involved, prosecute it. But I think there is an ethos among some elements of the Democrat Party that is, we're just entitled to win. I have poll watched. I can tell you, some areas you can just tell, this is kind of how we do this. We've always done this. We know the rules. This is what we do. There's an ethos there. So imagine if you're not Texas, but you're some state that has that ethos dominating your state legislature, you'll never get them to correct these kind of issues.
That's absolutely right. But even in Texas, our elected leaders aren't really paying a lot of attention to this. I mean, we've got the governorship, the lieutenant governorship, the attorney general, the SOS, and all the legislature. And nobody is really getting out there and doing much about it. And it's ridiculous. But back to your earlier point, you are right, Deb. There needs to be some sort of federal standards when there is a federal election, because it's critical infrastructure. And that is what the Department of Homeland Security should be paying attention to. They have an entire area called CISA, C-I-S-A, Cyber Intelligence Community Administration, I think, that should be looking at these things. But where is CISA when you say, well, our votes are being held on a server in Frankfurt, Germany? Where is CISA going, wait a minute, what are our votes being held outside this country about? And those are the people who tell CNN and MSNBC and Fox News and everybody else who's winning the election. It's crazy.
It is crazy. And actually, I think most people don't know that. And they assume all of us have this reverence for our election system, for the whole concept of we the people and voting, and this is how we have a peaceful transition of power every time, is because everyone trusts the election, or trusts the voting process. And if you can't trust it, I think there's a determination that the American people shouldn't be worried. They want everyone to trust it. But if we're at the place where we are, as you're describing, I mean, you feel like we have to do something about it. I always end up saying things have to change. You can't uncover these problems and say, well, that's really terrible. We have to uncover them and then figure out what to do about them.
Yep, I think you're absolutely right. And one of the jobs that needs to happen after this election's over, whoever wins, win, lose, or draw, is that we need to completely change what's going on in the election systems. And I think that the U.S., for instance, could mandate, without running elections, could mandate that, for instance, all elections have to be run based on blockchain. Now, blockchain can be hacked, but at least there is an audit trail in blockchain that allows you to see that happen.
Define blockchain. Describe what blockchain.
Blockchain was the system that really undergirded the creation of Bitcoin. And it's like a permanent library of every transaction that is done. And you can hack it and change the transaction, but you can't hack the underlying transaction that came before it. So you can always find, it's like a permanent audit trail. And that's what needs to happen. But there's also standards that need to be put out there. Right now, in election system, the only standard is what's called EAC 1.01. That's Elections Administration Commission 101. And all that says is that this piece of voting equipment has to be able to withstand a drop from this far and still function. It can't emit more than this amount of radiation, vibration, durability, stuff like that. Nothing about security. Nothing.
Wow.
There are no U.S. security standards.
That is quite amazing. Well, actually, I love your organization. First of all, I think it's amazing and wonderful you've taken on this task. Again, I never want to say the name incorrectly. Allied Security Operations Group, or as everyone in Texas calls it, ASOG. And you're hard work at all of this. And I love all of this being exposed, and you're at least trying to get through the proper authorities and let them know what you've uncovered. But unless there are changes, you begin to lose faith in the election system, and then it's a very unhappy time for America. So for next week, after we have this election in our country, I would love to have, while everything is, assuming we can settle down after the election, we ought to have attention paid at the state level in every state and in Congress. What is Congress constitutionally permitted to do? What can they limit? What can they say this must be done this way? And then at the state level, the other big issue I can see in the state level is the decision that the penalties for any form of ballot harvesting, any form of manipulation, any form of cheating, anyone who permits someone to vote as a clerk or an election judge who shouldn't vote, any form of cheating, voting twice, has to carry such penalties that everyone is scared to death to do it. That's what has to happen. They have to be scared to death. It's like, for the same reason they wouldn't rob a bank, they would not cheat in voting. That has to be, it has to have that level of seriousness in our penal code.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
Absolutely. Russ Ramsland, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome, and thank you.
Really fun to have you here.